you saying that any Israeli business that employs Palestinians will not be boycotted? That's a very important point. Are you saying that any Israeli business that employs Arab Palestinians will not be subject to the boycott?
This is not the reality for most Palestinians on the ground in the West Bank.
How do you know that?
They are subjected to violence, repeated violence, house evictions, demolitions, violence, perpetual violence. There is zero accountability. Israel is now evolving into a pariah state internationally because of these activities.
Joining us today are two guests with deep expertise in international law, with very different perspectives on this issue. Andreas Motzfeldt Kravik is Deputy Foreign Minister of Norway. He's a lawyer by training and has worked extensively on international law within the Norwegian government. Natasha Hausdorff is an expert in international law and law of armed conflict, a British barrister and legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust, and she's a frequent commentator on the legal aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Welcome to the both of you.
The ICJ has clarified most recently in its advisory opinion that the settlements are not just illegal. Israel has an obligation to dismantle the settlements, to pull out of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and also Gaza. And this is not only confirmed by the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, in a unanimous decision, save for one justice who took this viewpoint, but this is also the majority position or almost a unanimous position by all states, certainly all European states, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Australia, Canada, even for the most part, the United States have all taken the position that these settlements are illegal. This is one country occupying another country, and Norway has always been on the front line of opposing occupation. When you look at what's happening within the settlements, the settler, the repression against Palestinians, the evictions of houses, the demolition of houses, these are actions that have to be rebuffed, have to be counteracted, to be clear-eyed about what's happening on the West Bank and in East Jerusalem and Gaza. These are illegal settlements, again, confirmed by the ICJ, confirmed by most states, also the Security Council, and we will do everything we can to push back on these developments.
May I ask one question? Yes. Who is it occupied from? You say this is one country occupying another country.
Well, they're a Palestinian territory. That's straightforward.
But that's never been a country, and that's never been Palestinian territory. There is a phenomenon here which is very worrying, which is that international law buzzwords are being used, contrary to what international law actually says, to promote a particular agenda. And, what is the dismantling of Jewish communities here other than ethnically cleansing Jews from this territory? The fact that the International Court of Justice has, as you have indicated, said that it will require or request or wants to see the ethnic cleansing of Jews from this space doesn't make that in any way morally or legally acceptable. And you and I both know that an International Court of Justice advisory opinion is not binding in any way. It does not create international law obligations. It absolutely did continue to promote this sort of position, everybody says, which you yourself have referred to, this is settled and lots of countries take this position. That doesn't make it right in international law, and it doesn't create an international law binding obligation, which you indeed should know as a lawyer. What we've seen is the continual misstatement of both the facts and the law, and this comes to the sort of violence that you've referred to. A lot of this, of course, is being promoted by a lot of the media misinformation here, but when we look at some of the reports that even the ministry has relied upon in relation to the consultation paper with respect to this trade ban, we can see its very strict reliance on UN reports, statistics, figures, and it's important to qualify that because in relation to the violence that you've referred to, the United Nations itself has put out data that considers an elementary school class visiting the ancient site of Shiloh to be settler violence. It considers escorted visits of Jews onto the Temple Mount to be settler violence. This is not just an inversion of international law or a disapplication of it or even double standards when we consider real situations of occupation around the world, real situations of, if you will, illegal settlements that are never picked upon, that are never called illegal, and that are never subject to these sorts of proposals on trade and sanctions. But even before we get to that, the misinformation that is put out at a very basic level in order to justify this position that Jews should be expelled from these areas is morally reprehensible. And quite apart from that, it is providing an unsound basis for the pseudo-legal analysis which follows, which this consultation paper is rife with, which could put Norway in a very difficult position vis-a-vis the real obligations that it is subject to in terms of its trade relationship with Israel, in terms of its responsibilities under the WTO, in terms of US sanctions and legislation in relation to boycott of Israeli businesses operating in Israeli-administered territories. So in respect of all of those, this is a proposal, a position that is seeking, I don't quite understand it, to ignore the realities of the law and the facts on the ground, and potentially put the Norwegian government in breach of what real international law says.
What you are putting forward as a legal position are not shared by anyone. There's not a single state beyond Israel who's taking that position. And these arguments that you're putting forward, that this is not an illegal occupation, has been tried and tested. It has been put before various tribunals. It has always been contested and rebuffed at the end. It has been litigated before various country parliaments in countries, various cabinets, various governments, always rebuffed. And even the United States, for the most part, have claimed that these settlements are not in line with international law. I think the term has been usually inconsistent with international law. And again, this is the position of the Norwegian government. I don't think that you'll find, and I know this is a domestic argument, but I don't think you'll find one singular Norwegian political party, at least not represented in parliament, who take the position that you are now advocating.
But I
all
want to
the
make a clear
Norwegian
distinction.
politicians would claim,
Yeah.
will claim that these settlements are illegal.
May I just pick up the example of
Natasha.
Russia? Because my position is that the analysis so far that you've put forward is incoherent. You use the example of Russia occupying parts of Ukraine and said that you were being consistent in your analysis, but you're doing the complete inverse of that. Because the reason there is international consensus that Russia has occupied Crimea from Ukraine is because Ukraine's borders also followed uti possidetis juris. Answer me this, and then please set out the rest of your legal position. If Ukraine were to recover Crimea from Russia in the same way that Israel recovered Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem from the Jordanians who had occupied it between 1949 and 1967, would you accuse Ukraine of occupying Crimea from Russia? And if not, why the double standard for Israel?
First and foremost, I'm not sure who's asking the questions here, but that's an obvious misstatement, or at least it's a logical fallacy. Obviously, as you said, there's an international consensus, at least something that borders on an international consensus, that Russia has occupied and is trying to annex part of Ukraine. I agree, but there's just to be clear about this, the international consensus that Israel is occupying the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem is equally robust or even stronger. An occupation can be illegal. I'll grant you that point. Under international law, an occupation can be legal, but obviously inherent in the topic of occupation is the term temporary. But there's nothing temporary about this. In fact,
because it's not an occupation.
Structural. But my point, it seems to me that you're not labeling this as a temporary occupation. It seems that you think that this is Israeli territory. You think that Israel...
That's what international law says,
Right.
the same international law that you would apply to Ukraine.
Position. This is a minority of a minority position.
Deputy Minister, you do appreciate that the UN doesn't create states. The UN doesn't give states territory. The UN doesn't
The UN doesn't create states? Is that your position?
Of course it doesn't create states. The UN doesn't have any power of that nature.
So the Security Council can't talk about sovereignty?
Well, certainly we've not had a single Security Council resolution here with any binding effect. These are political declarations. What I'm talking about is a return to actual international law. And what I'm really concerned about is that in addition to these misrepresentations of international law, we're getting a rewriting of history. The notion that there was a Palestinian state, that it had its land taken away, that it would recover that territory. This is a very basic misrepresentation of the historical narrative, let alone the legal frameworks that therefore apply. And so if you're getting the first one wrong, one doesn't have much hope on the proper application of the latter, that the combination or the comparison with Ukraine here is pretty stark. And the fact that, it's not just you, of course, Deputy Minister, I don't want to make this overly personal, but the fact that there are even lawyers out there that would seek to make that argument that on the one hand, they would say Ukraine has sovereign title to Crimea, and on the other say that Israel has no sovereign title nor claim to these disputed territories, in particular East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, is worse than double standards. It is a misapplication of international law in the extreme, which I would argue renders the international legal order itself at threat, because, if everybody says is how we're now judging international legal situations, the international legal order ultimately loses credibility.
Yeah. Well, can I just briefly intervene and say, I think that the fact that you're referring to these areas as Judea and Samaria sort of gives away the game. You think that this belongs to Israel. You think that this is a place where Israel can or Israelis can settle based on their own will. Again, that's a position taken by no serious government. In fact, beyond Israel, I don't think that there is a single government who's taking this position. But be that as it may, I think what's important for me and for us is to just state unequivocally that our position is aligned with most governments, aligned with the International Court of Justice, aligned with almost all decisions taken by various international entities, that these are illegal settlements and they should be rebuffed. They should not be recognized by sovereign states. So we will certainly not recognize these as settlers belonging to Israel. In fact, we will do the opposite. We will do everything we can to ensure that they will not thrive, that they are undermined, and that Palestine can control their own territory, just as Israel can control its territory.
Now you're putting words in my mouth. There's a very simple answer to the conundrum that you are struggling with, and that's the Oslo Accords. Because since the 1990s, there has been a very clear administrative framework whereby these territories have been administered, whereby Palestinians have self-determination under the Palestinian Authority in the Palestinian autonomy in areas A and B. And these bizarre notions and broad sweeping allegations of the way that Palestinians are treated are simply incompatible with the facts. I'm just looking here at measures in East Jerusalem that the ICJ claimed was creating an inhospitable environment for Palestinians. But according to a Palestinian news agency poll, 93% of Arab residents of East Jerusalem preferred a continuation of Israeli rule in the United City. And Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, 86% of Arab residents of Jerusalem are satisfied with their lives. That's also consistent with the movements of people that I very simply referred to a poll by a Palestinian news agency that found that 93% of Arab residents of East Jerusalem could prefer a continuation of Israeli rule. Also a survey by Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics that 86% of Arab residents of East Jerusalem are satisfied with their lives. That is simply inconsistent with the broad brush sweeping statements that you have made.
Do you think most Palestinians on the West Bank and in Gaza are satisfied with their lives?
Israel doesn't govern them. Those that Israel does
Israel doesn't govern the West Bank?
I explained to you, those in East Jerusalem that Israel has given residency, and there's an option for them to apply also for citizenship. That was what this poll referred to.
Are you saying that there is an occupation, but the occupation is legal?
I don't know how
are you
I
saying
could
that there is no occupation?
I've said from the very beginning of this that the framework of occupation is entirely inapplicable where territory has been recovered.
It doesn't work. All right. So I just want to say for the record, and this is important for the viewers and listeners, this is not a position which is taken seriously internationally. There is no government taking this position.
I'm sorry, we're just back to this, fallback position of everybody says. Everybody says it's not international law. It is not the equal.
Natasha,
it's not a reflection of what international law really says here. And we see that on the basis that in every other situation of real occupation, as envisaged by the Fourth Geneva Convention, and real transfer of individuals under Article 496 in Western Sahara, in Cambodia and Vietnam, in Northern Cyprus, certainly in Crimea, in Abkhazia in relation to Russian activities. In all of these instances, this argument is never put forward. So you cannot advance a credible analysis on international law when it only applies to the one Jewish state. I'm really conscious that the Deputy Minister doesn't have very much time because we started late. And I do feel the need to say, even if you ignore everything that we have previously discussed, and we'll work on the false position that there is some illegality here. Nothing in international law justifies a trade ban, and we're talking about Jews in Jerusalem here. So the deputy minister can talk all he likes about wanting to foster a positive trading relationship with Israel. There is a discrimination at play here, which is unconscionable and illegal, and will put Norway in breach, not just of the agricultural agreement between the Kingdom of Norway and the State of Israel from 2021, but also the FTA between EFTA states and Israel from 1993, obligations that Norway has thereunder. We mentioned previously obligations under the World Trade Organization, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the General Agreement on Trade and Services. I mentioned previously also US, state and federal laws that this would fall foul of. All also require the US to essentially consider and address this issue of boycotts against certain businesses operating in Israeli-administered territory when negotiating trade agreements. So Norway is going to be really harming itself vis-a-vis potential relationships with states. Quite apart from all of that, we're not dealing here with Norwegian to Israel state-to-state trade, which seems to be what the deputy minister and indeed the consultation agreement is driving at. We're dealing with private businesses that has no place in the analysis that we've heard so far. And then we move on to the actual international agreements that govern not just the administration of this territory, but also the application of trades and tariffs. And I've mentioned the Oslo Accords. We also have the Paris Protocol of 1994. And all of this has been endorsed by the international community and has been thrown out of the window. Now, I have to say the ministry acknowledges a breach of WTO provisions. And I think it's also important in that respect to highlight Article 26(5)(a) of the GATT that talks about international responsibility for the territory. So it's important that these trade agreements all approach questions of sovereignty on territory neutrally, and they work according to who administers the trade area, who deals with tariffs and customs, and in every respect, and according to the Palestinian Authority itself, that's Israel. And most recently, in 2020, when the ICC asked President Mahmoud Abbas to confirm the status of the Oslo Accords, he said that they were still valid. So all of this makes very little sense to me. On the flip side, we've had these references to UN Security Council resolutions, which are political, not binding, not legal instruments. We've had references to advisory opinions of the ICJ, which are likewise not legally binding. But even if you ignore that, none of them create international law obligations. Norway's international law obligations under these trade provisions are clear. How on earth can you sell this proposal to the people of Norway when it puts them at such risk of these consequences when these obligations are breached?
We are not under an obligation under the WTO to grant rights to occupying powers. And again, this is occupied territory. And this is our reading of the law, and this is the reading of the law which is shared by almost all other countries. And I just want to come back to this notion that I'm referring back to what others are saying, and this is that everyone says, and that's sort of a simple argument. The reason why I'm saying this is not just simply to make it clear that the position being advocated by Natasha is a minority position. It's also not how international law works.
But we're coming back to this notion that I don't know another way of expressing this other than everybody says. What UN Security Council resolutions have opined on in relation to this, they're political declarations. I'm not saying ignore them. I'm simply saying they're not in any way valid for the argument that you're putting forward, because they're political, not legal. If you look at what real international law says, not least in terms of the underlying legal frameworks, but also in terms of Norway's obligations under these trade obligations and trade agreements, then the Norwegians are going to be in trouble.
Andreas, Turkey occupies northern Cyprus, so why is there no Norwegian trade ban there?
Well, we have been very clear about the northern Turkey. That's not something that we're recognizing, and we have also an advisory out that has also been applicable to northern Turkey, but that's not the occupation there. It cannot be analogized to what's happening on the West Bank with the settler violence, with the eviction, etc., etc. So we have decided to put this forward because we do think it's important to make it clear that these settlements in Israel, that Israel is organizing now in Palestine, are just not in line with international law.
Okay, we're not going to agree clearly on the implementation of this and the implications for Norway or the international law framework. What about the implications for the Arab Palestinian local population that is employed in these businesses? I'm looking at figures that indicated in May 2025, 32,000 Palestinians were working in what you call Israeli settlement.
There's a carve out in the proposed list to products or services which are underpinning Palestinian activities in the West Bank, exactly.
But these are Jewish-owned businesses, which you're targeting. You're targeting Jewish-owned businesses. We're
not targeting Jewish organizations or businesses or enterprises. We're targeting settlements. We're targeting enterprises.
What does that mean?
And individuals who are not respecting Palestinian sovereignty. This is not very complicated.
There is no Palestinian sovereignty. You talk about settlement
if you
businesses.
Deny that there is Palestinian sovereignty on the West Bank. I have to be clear about this.
But the Oslo Accords make it clear that there isn't.
Palestine has sovereignty on the West Bank. That sovereignty is being undermined by Israel, predominantly through these settlements. And that's exactly why. In fact, you're highlighting why we're pushing back on these settlements. They are hindering Palestine from being able to implement its sovereignty. And that's why we're so clear-eyed about this, and that's why we're determined to put this forward.
You don't seem to understand the point that I'm making, though. These are businesses that you call settlement businesses. That just means that they're Israeli-owned businesses operating in the vicinity of Jewish communities in the area. And they employ, look, before the 7th of October, for good reason, it was even higher, 48,000 was the estimate then. Unfortunately, many of those work permits couldn't be renewed because the fact is that Arab Palestinian workers were gaining intelligence, were gathering information that assisted in the massacre of the 7th of October. But the fact of the matter is, if Norwegians and the Norwegian government really care about the prosperity of Palestinians in the area, the ability of the Palestinian economy to continue to grow, then what on earth are these tens of thousands of Arabs being employed in Israeli-run businesses in these territories and the hundreds of thousands that are dependent on those jobs when you think about their family dependents? What are they going to do as a result of becoming unemployed?
This is a valid question. I'm glad we're having this discussion. I think that's a valid point and a fair inquiry. So just to be clear, in terms of the law that has been drafted, it has a explicit carve out for Palestinians in the law. So that has been dealt with in terms of what we're putting forward. We'll see how that goes in terms of the consultation, which is now transpiring, but this has been dealt with. But I just want to make...
Are you saying that any Israeli business that employs Palestinians will not be boycotted?
When you're asking a question, I have to be allowed to respond.
I need to clarify that point. Forgive me. That's a very important point. Are you saying that any Israeli business that employs Arab Palestinians will not be subject to the boycott?
I think that there is a narrative out there, which I think some listeners, viewers might subscribe to, that, this is all perfect. This is all nice and well. You have Israeli enterprises and they're employing tens of thousands of Palestinians and, predominantly they are satisfied with how things are going. This is not the reality for most Palestinians on the ground in the West Bank.
How do you know that?
They are subjected to violence, repeated violence, house evictions, demolitions, violence, perpetual violence. There is zero accountability. This is not also, and this has been my point also when I've been on this podcast on previous occasions. This is a clear violation of international law, a clear violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law, but it's also not productive for Israel. Israel is now evolving into a pariah state internationally because of these activities. Now, you can sit and advocate that these are sound policies and this is based on international legal norms, but they're not. And they're hurting Israel. And we're saying we're a friend of Israel, and that's why we're pushing back on these activities.
That's all. Can you please answer the question? Are you saying that if Israeli-run businesses... That if Israeli-run businesses employ Arab Palestinians, they will be exempt from this trade ban? That was the implication of what you said.
I'm saying that there is a carve-out in the law, but this is still being discussed, so we'll see how we...
Is that the intention of the ministry?
A carve-out in the law, exactly for the reasons that you highlighted. Lots of Palestinians, given the fact that there is no other alternative for many of them, have been working on the settlements and they have an income that is derived from some of these settlement activities. And there is a carve out to ensure that Palestinians are not hurt by what we're putting forward. Yes, there
How
it
on
is. So we'll
earth are
see
you
how
going to
this will be
enforce that?
formulated at the end of the consultation. But this is what we're trying to achieve, and that's exactly to respond to the inquiry that you put forward.
It's extraordinary, and it should not be lost that these proposals include criminal sanction within Norway. The idea that a framework would be put forward that is so nebulous, so unclear, where basic questions of what is actually targeted by this legislation cannot be answered, that would lead to potential criminal liability is nothing short of extraordinary. And it should worry every Norwegian citizen. And indeed, it has extraterritorial applicability on the current proposal. So it should worry others also. I can't see anyone wanting to conduct business with Norway in these circumstances. And unfortunately, the inability to answer partially produced goods in businesses adjacent to settlements. There's no such thing as settlement businesses. These are private entities that are operating in these areas that employ lots of people from the local communities, including Jews, Arabs, Christians. The idea that there would be a distinction based on the ethnicity of employees or business owners, that's also unclear, is morally reprehensible. And the fact that so many would be led by what can only appears to me to be blind hatred for the Jewish population in these areas to embark upon enterprises of this nature, which are so confused, so incoherent, and so contrary to existing international legal frameworks, is mind-boggling. If it passes as the minister seems confident it will be, I'm sure there will be consequences, very negative ones, for the local population in the area, Jews and Arabs alike, and no doubt for Norwegians as well.